I would like to show you how informal testing happens within iALM.ai. The chart you see in front of you shows both informal and formal testing. The informal testing, or we sometimes call exploratory testing, or testing on the fly, is above the line here, and the formal testing is below the line. There are three ways by which you can do informal testing in iALM.ai. The first method, which we normally recommend, is simply to go from a user story when you take one user story at a time and break it down into a number of scenarios. Some of those scenarios are positive scenarios, which represent the normal course of actions, while other scenarios, negative scenarios, which represent the abnormal, extreme, uncommon, and what we sometimes call shall not do situations, like when a user tries to do something that he or she is not supposed to do. Once you break down the user story into a number of scenarios, you can take any scenario and create a number of informal test cases. This is the first method by which you can create informal test cases. The second way to create informal test cases is for those who, for one reason or another, do not want to use scenarios, although the use of scenarios as a way to break down the user story is a very powerful process, which we will cover in a different recording. In this case, they can take a user story and create informal test cases directly without going through scenarios. The third method to create informal test cases is what we call ad hoc, or on-the-fly testing. That's when you are just testing without being restricted by a specific user story of a scenario. In this case, you can go ahead and create an informal test case anytime. There is always a place for this kind of testing, although of course we hope this does not represent a big portion of your testing. Now, let me show you how you can perform these three methods to create informal test cases in the iALM.ai platform. By the way, since iALM.ai treat user stories and requirements seamlessly, everything in this recording applies the same way whether your project is an Agile project using user stories or a non-Agile project using requirements. Okay, this is my user story tree or requirement tree. Now, let me just go quick and open one user story. I'm going to open this, user story number 37. Now you can see all the details of the user story. And if you look here, you'll see that this user story has 5 scenarios. You can also see formal test cases, informal test cases, and so on. So, let me now click on this to see those 5 scenarios. You can see for every scenario, it shows whether it is negative or positive. It also gives me these 3 parameters that the iALM.ai platform uses to determine the testing priority of a scenario. All this is explained in a different recording titled Using AI to Perfect User Stories Through Scenarios. Notice that these 5 scenarios were created by the AI assistant within iALM.ai. You may also create more scenarios, if you wish, manually, without using the AI assistant. Now, let me just go ahead and open one of those scenarios. I'll open scenario number 361. It shows you here all the details of scenario. When a scenario is created by AI assistant or by a team member, it will have the steps that someone needs to follow in order to test the scenario. You can also see a test set here that was created for this scenario, but I don't want you to worry about it now because test sets come to place only when we are doing formal testing, which is covered under a different recording. So, for now, let's focus on the informal testing. If I scroll down here, I can see that there is an informal test case that was created for this scenario. I want you to pay attention to the steps which I said someone would need to follow to test the scenario. I also want you to pay attention to the expected behavior of scenario. This simply describes how we expect the system to react when this scenario is encountered in production. Once we have a scenario like this, we can create any number of informal test cases. Let's look at the one informal test case which has already been created. Let's see how it looks. The first thing you see right away is that the steps we had in the scenario have already been copied here in the informal test case. Also, the expected behavior of the scenario has been copied here into the expected results of the informal test case. So, when you create an informal test case from a scenario, some work is already done for you. This is the first method by which you can create an informal test case. The second way to create an informal test case, as I mentioned, is when you are just looking at a user story or a requirement and you just want to go ahead and create an informal test case without going through a scenario. So let me go back to my user story number 37, and here is my only informal test case that we just saw. Let me open it here. I can now create a second informal test case for the same user story. You can see here, when I am creating an informal test case directly from a user story or a requirement without going through a scenario, no information like steps or expected results are copied into the informal test case. The last method to create informal test cases, as I mentioned, is when a tester is looking at an application or a system and just wants to test without thinking of a specific user story, requirement, or a scenario. Just test. This is very much what people do when they practice exploratory testing. The way to do this is to go here on the left bar where you can see all project entities outside the context of any user story or requirement. Here you can see all the informal test cases that were created for this project, regardless of whether they were created from a scenario, or directly from a user story, or even just created like this one I'm about to create. Now I just have to go here to create another informal test case. Again, this would be a good way to document what testers are doing when they practice exploratory testing. We just covered the 3 methods by which you can do informal testing in iALM.ai. We strongly recommend that you watch the recording titled Formal Testing in iALM.ai.